Hello there, kind viewers. This is a compilation of all 4 parts of an experimental mini-series I had created, where I revamped all of the major character assets in my quote-unquote object show, Last Lifeline. For those of you who haven't heard of it yet, yeah, suspicious quotation marks, I get it, but the reason for them is because it wasn't originally my concept. Rather, this is an object show version of a camp that was made by my friend Calculovo. And before you ask, yes, permission was given to make this show. And for those of you who have heard of it, let me explain why I'm remaking these assets briefly. It's because they're old. I've learned a lot more asset making and design techniques in Adobe Animate since I made the assets for this show originally. Reminder, these were made back in late 2022, and with my artist skills only continuing to enhance themselves since then, it almost felt essential to keep the assets of the show up to par. We'll be going in alphabetical order for the most part, so without further ado, let's begin. We are starting with the main host of this DanganRonpa inspired object show, Monocoin. There's 2 hosts, but we'll get to the other one in a second. But let's be real here, the balancing between the personalities of the 2 hosts are pretty similar to a yin-yang situation at times. Monocoin is the more sadistic host, which makes sense since alongside being inspired by DanganRonpa, this show was also inspired by Yes, that is a dead meme, but no, it is not a spoiler alert for Last Lifeline. For Cal's Lifeline, maybe, but not this. But they refuse to socialize with others whenever they don't have to. The other host is less sadistic, but ends up being in charge of the more direct matters that Monocoin refuses to handle herself. One of the primary differences between the asset remake and the original asset is that there are less internal lines. A ton of different object asset makers have reduced upon the usage of internal lines for a better looking product, and after trying it for myself, I can agree, it does look a lot better. The overall shading of the object has changed as well, making it a little less unanimous, and hopefully as a result, a little more unique visually. Also, when I made the original Monocoin asset, I didn't think too much of what some of the objects displayed in the asset were. The bottom strokes of her body were meant to represent vines? Whatever plant it is called sloping around the bottom of the Monokuma head. But in the original, I didn't do that. I just did strokes, which made the original asset feel more fake, and not a truthful interpretation of the Monocoin. Yes, even if it is true that Calculovo did that for her Monocoin assets as well, really, this first asset was made as an experiment to see if I could really improve the Last Lifeline assets that much. And after finishing it, I felt like I definitely would be able to. And because I felt like that first asset recreation was successful, that is the reason why you see this mini-series as a whole to begin with. Now, it's time for the other host, and also someone who is an actual pain in the ass to make perspective for, Ginscap. For anyone out there who is a watcher or player of the game Your Turn to Die, this character may seem familiar, and that's because they are an objectification of the YTD character Ginabushi, or more specifically, the hide or cap that Gin commonly wore. The remake of this asset wasn't too drastically different from the original version, but the color palette was changed slightly, and the shading was made slightly more dynamic to fit better with the actual form of the character. You might also notice the headspace in the hide was made a little larger as well. I got a lot of these shading and color palette techniques from a good friend Indigo, who isn't active in the YouTube space, but if you saw their assets, you'd know they are an incredible asset maker, someone I've looked up to for asset creation for a while. And to provide an example, let me quickly paste here the Ginscap asset that she made, since she actually made assets for the Lifeline contestants as well. Oh yeah, and Monocoin too, how could I forget? But enough about simping for those I consider to be better artists. Here's one last change I can't forget to mention when it comes to Ginscap, the ears. In the original asset, looking back, I personally think they look more like horns than ears. If you've seen a picture of Ginabushi in her cap, you know that they are supposed to be ears. And so, I updated that part of the asset to actually look more like ears. Oh yeah, and I also forgot to mention the cat head they carry around with them, yet more symbolism to Ginabushi. The ears held similar issues, and thus looked almost more like a devil's head when you're looking at it without its separate face. But with that, this asset is done, and I can already say that trying to make perspective assets of this character is going to suck. Perhaps if I learned Blender, then it might be a little easier. Next up, we have Blank Square, or as the creator often liked to nickname them by, Squank. I actually recorded the creation of this specific asset before I recorded the creation of Gin's Cap, since they are by far the simplest out of all the designs in the cast. And thus, you might be left asking, but Chroma, it's just a white square, how are you possibly going to make it something more? And to that, my answer is texturing and shading. Yes, it is true that Blank Square is, well, blank. But when I saw Blank Square again, trying to think of how I might enhance their design, I thought about how paper or cardboard looked like. I believe that if Squank was giving the shading of a more realistic object, then it might be able to enhance the design without losing the charm of it being, well, a blank square. And I'm not sure if that idea necessarily worked out, but personally I would say so at least. Hopefully my personal opinion on this actually works out, and not unlike the original version of the pilot episode where I accidentally wrote this character extremely terribly. Let's not talk about that, please. I forget I mentioned that. That's not going to go over well if people knew about that. Me butchering other people's characters. Nah, I'm just kidding. I don't care about it that much. Are you ready for a little bit of fire and fury? Because this next character is sure to give you just that. And I can say that very assuringly because he is my character, Chess Piece. I will say as well, this character, the redesign, ended up feeling very different from the original version. Because even though it is still the same object, there was a lot of design changes that I made to him. All of this mostly has to do with the overall shape of the object, and trying as much as I could to make it look like a genuine chess piece. Also, I was switching back and forth between my Adobe Animate application and my references way too much during the redesign of this character. Probably because I was consistently worried about the shape not being correct to his form. And thanks to a tiny bit of Indigo influence, I thought that changing the shape a little bit might have helped. You might also notice at this point that I have drastically reduced on the amount of interior lines in this asset as well. It's for the same reasons as why I made this decision with the Monocoin asset remake. Thinking it looked better than with the interior lines, influence from other asset creators, yada yada yada. What matters here though is that I definitely do think it helped this design, although it is going to feel weird to use for some time, because the original asset wasn't so bulky at the bottom. However, there is at least a little bit of time for everything where I felt weird changing a part of him. So perhaps over time this will fade over as well. We can only hope. But one thing that definitely won't fade over is the amount of resentment he has for the hosts. Yes, he will still carry that deep resentment against Monocoin that he held from the camp version. But the reasons for why that is the case might not be quite the same. You'll just have to see. Alright, that one was a little bit too dramatic maybe. Let's bring down the tone a little bit with a less antagonistic, but definitely still energetic character, Clay Pigeon. who actually managed to get into an episode of BFB as a recommended character, and as a result caused a tiny debate on whether or not they should actually be let into the cast because, fun fact, they originally weren't supposed to be here. In the camp version, they were a debuter that entered on episode 12, over halfway through the entire competition, and somehow they were one of the 3 winners. Don't ask me because I don't know either. And that was originally planned for the show version as well, but they were introduced into the starting cast after some controversies arose with one of the other contestants. Don't ask me, because you're not supposed to know. Capiche? Anyways, you might notice that the old asset looks like it has a Pac-Man engraved into it. That's what it looked like to me too when I saw the character for the first time, since I had no clue what the fudge a clay pigeon was. But don't worry, I searched up what it was while I was making the remake asset, and that's how I got a different assumption that it was supposed to look like a crack. Clay pigeon was a rather sporty figure for a rather fragile object, so it would make sense. Some of the extra details you see here, primarily the extra lines on the rims of the object itself, are meant to give those final impressions on what this object was. The clay pigeon is a lot more ridged than in the first asset I made of this character, so they're meant to represent those smaller ridges you would see on the edge of the clay pigeon in real life. Also, the circular pattern in the center was a bit of an indigo influence as well. The amount of times I've mentioned indigo here makes it feel like I've sold out my art style in favor of another artist, doesn't it? But that's not true at all. She and many other object asset artists may be inspiration for how to improve my own art style, but I don't try to copy them directly. I just go with what I think looks best, and to me, this is what looks best for a clay pigeon. Also, I had to remove one more internal line off camera just as a note for the comparison display. Now, we have a little bit of a roadblock here. Literally. This next character is Construction, whose personality doesn't actually have anything to do with construction, but they are a massive snob. Or at least they're a massive snob for someone in enough debt to get caught up in this situation. The design of this character was heavily based off of the road sign emoji, which might explain why the side poles almost reach down to the ground lower than his legs do. And although most of the changes in this remade asset come in the form of color and shading changes, there was another change that I realized with a bit of indigo influence would definitely help out his design. Adding another connector between the 2 metal poles, that is. And his legs would be attached to that connector instead of to the main road sign, just to make them look a little bit taller. The reason I added this change was so that it could look more like an actual Roblox sign instead of just the emoji of a Roblox sign. Also, I had mentioned a theoretical reason as to why the original asset looked like this in the separate video of part 1, but it was wrong, by the way. The actual reason, with help from GB Lime, or Swank's creator, was for a character debut in a camp that the creator, Grassy BSR, had signed up for. But they only typed the emoji with left GB Lime to draw it in their own terms. Although the actual drawing was an absolute joke, the creator decided to make it one of their OCs regardless. But I didn't want it to keep feeling like an emoji. I wanted to try and make every asset remake feel a bit more lifelike, even if this was still so heavily cartoonish. Because even in a cartoon, the eye can still detect if they think something is fake. I don't want that with any of these characters, not even those that don't exist in real life. And thus, Construction was modified slightly. Last asset in this first part of the LL asset recreation process, we have a little bit of a character fraud here. Not because the character itself is a stolen design, but they are quite literally a defective Lego. They are supposed to be highly reminiscent of Lego for both Object Madness and Object Invasion, but they have been deformed. Only one arm, a scar over their left eye, and a stud being placed on their side instead of on their top. Dago, as their current voice actor has humorously nicknamed them by, also seems to have the intelligence of a deformity, as they pretend to be extremely stupid. Even if this is purely an act, kind of like Taco II, their actual intelligence is still below average. And yes, that was a spoiler alert, sorry y'all. I was just trying to find stuff to talk about for this character since the design didn't change that much. The major thing that is noticeable is the shine on the front of their body, caused by some indigo influence of course, and also the usage of some gradation to make the asset feel more vibrant. But other than that, most of the changes involve the actual color palette of the character. And I ran out of stuff to talk about with them unfortunately, so sorry. Next up, we have the dollar bill, whose personality seems to be worth just as much as their actual values, not that much at all. And before I end up getting complaints such as, boo, background character, let me say something about Dollar. They act as if they're a background character on purpose. I can't exactly reveal how that will affect interactions within the show itself, but just keep that in mind for now. Their old design also looked like they were a background character, and considering how I was going around and updating all of the assets, I would need to fix that. Dollar needed to look more like a dollar bill. Some indigo influence came into play with the color schemes and texturing here, and it also inspired me to change his design a bit more, trying to make him feel less like Monopoly money and more realistic, primarily by adding those borders on the rims and more simplified features of the American dollar. Also, just as a note, the little bits of shading you see primarily in the center of the asset are meant to represent a wrinkled paper effect, because tell me, when was the last time you saw a perfectly flat dollar bill? Furthermore, this might be one of the few assets that actually made a little bit more dull in color scheme. My asset style isn't just about a whole lot of vibrancy like you may have thought from some of these assets. Realism comes into play too. And this is actually still not dull enough for an actual dollar bill. I leave this remake like this, however, just so we all know I'm not trying to go 100% on realism. This is still an animated cartoon, guys. Now, we have the G's. There's quite a number of characters in the cast whose names actually start with the letter G, or more specifically, 5 if you include Gin's Cap. As for the contestants, the first of the G's I'll be showcasing is this one, Galiano Garlic. I don't actually know where the hell the Galiano part came from, but I assume it had to do with some garlic species biology bullcrap that I don't know much about. Regardless, just like Clay Pigeon, Galiano wasn't in the original cast. They got on as a debuter around episode 9 of Last Lifeline, but ended up placing dead last in the finale. I would say that's gotta hurt, but they excused. So what can I say? Technically, there was nothing wrong with the old design, but like it did look like garlic definitely, but it could have done a lot better with the shading since in the old asset the garlicky grooves were representative of just lines and not actual shading. Some indigo influence convinced me to actually shade in the grooves of the character. I overall ended up making them less pink in color as well. Yeah, I will say, there wasn't a whole lot that changed with this asset other than that. Even if it does look miles better than before in my opinion, a garlic bulb isn't exactly a complicated object compared to some of the others we have in the cast. Now, here's something funny to note. This cast actually has 2 characters of the same object type, being the tokens. That little tidbit might form a base for some of the future interactions that some characters will have with each other. But for now, here's one of the two tokens, Gamer. And for the record, the creation of this asset took me so much longer than I am mentally okay with. Despite seeming like a simpler character to recreate, their asset remake was one of the longest out of the entire cast thus far. You'll see what I mean later. For now, time to describe the details themselves. Gamer token's engravement was originally a controller's D-pad, but a little tidbit I'll mention for that as well, this old version of the asset wasn't even the oldest version of the asset. The very oldest version of this asset has the D-pad replaced with the common BFDI token signature of two characters, GT. And that was pretty freaking boring. And thus when I was contemplating revamping the assets for the first time back in summer of 2023, even though I never actually went through the revamped then, I did replace the text with the D-pad. But in the remake, the D-pad is replaced with an actual game controller, similar to the version of the asset that Indigo had made. The very specific way that I layered part of this asset is so different perspectives of this character can be made much more easily, by the way. Unfortunately, the front-facing asset isn't exactly a good example of that. Also, fun fact, remaking these headphones took me a lot longer than I expected as well. I consistently struggled getting the correct shape here, and a surprising amount of my time was spent on the headphones as a result. So yes, remaking the gamer token asset was somehow deceptively challenging. Also, I fixed these issues off camera, but I left the borders of the headphones too thin, and there's a microphone attached to the headphones that I forgot to add on here. Just as a note for the asset comparison, because Chroma here's a dumbass. Tell me, do you believe in astrology? Here's the thing, I personally don't, but there is a character based on the concept. More specifically, Gemini. This zodiac sign is supposed to reflect upon some playful and intellectually curious personality. And although the latter is true, they are a bit of a pessimist. This asset remake wasn't that complicated, so here's a brief story time, I guess. When Gemini was first introduced into the cast, the line, which is the name I've used to refer to the Last Lifeline staff team, had struggled to properly reflect him as a character. There was very little known about him at the time, since in Cal's Lifeline their creator had quit on episode 1. Eventually we did get an actual personality sorted out for him, but that was only because of a specific series of events. Remember in part 1 when I was discussing about Clay Pigeon, and I said that there was a character removed from the cast which allowed him to become a cast member from the beginning. But they were introduced into the starting cast after some controversies arose with one of the other contestants. Don't ask me, because you're not supposed to know. Capiche? Well, although it would be highly controversial to talk about the creator of this removed character, I will mention them briefly. This is chromium BII oxide peroxide. In May 2023, they were removed from the cast after something that I will not say here because that's a massive can of worms that I do not want to open. Thank you. One of the most bitter things about removing this character was the fact that they were one of the most developed in Cal's Lifeline, and many staff members in the line worried that removing him would cause a bunch of plot holes. I looked at Gemini, who was still lacking a personality, and thought about a way to compromise here. Although Chromium as a character will be physically removed, many of his character traits will be moved on to Gemini. Sorry for the long ramble there, but back to the asset. Very little had changed except for some color changes, and some shine was added to the asset, inspired by Indigo, once again. And that's it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, everyone. Is the glass half full, or is it half empty? Well, anyone who said the glass is half full is in the wrong here, sadly. Because the glass herself told me that it was half empty. This is Glass of Water, and she can be summarized as being a nervous wreck who happens to be so unlucky it's not even funny anymore. Even if she could bet both sides of a coin in a coin toss, in that case, the coin would land on its side. Now, I don't believe in divine intervention, but if you were in Water's shoes, or non-existent shoes because she's an object, I think you definitely would, considering the crap she has to deal with. And now for the asset itself, one of the main changes here was that I rounded the bottom of the glass. This was both inspired by Indigo and inspired by the shading of some glasses in real life. Although most cups aren't curved on the bottom like this unless they're made of plastic, sometimes the light can make it seem like so, and this is one of the times where I'll use a little bit of cartoonish over realism. There was also some shading adjustments, including adding some gradation to the glass itself. I didn't add it to the water, however, that would be carried over by the transparency of the glass. Now, it's important to note that there is no dark shading in this asset. Indigo once told me in a voice chat that it was not a good idea to add dark shading to a glass object because of the fact that glass is see-through and thus there is no dark side, which is why all dark shading from the original asset had been completely removed in the remake. We just need to get rid of the dark spots in Water's head now. Sometimes I feel like I'd lose my head if it weren't attached to my body. But for this next character, Highlighter, that isn't even a metaphor anymore. Also, if you mention Rainbow Riot, I'll give you a detachable head, alright? Regardless, their head can detach from the rest of their body, which means I have to make a separate asset for his headpiece. There are a couple major changes I made with this asset, which you'll see soon, but for now I'll mention how I try to improve the actual shading of the object. Both influenced by Indigo and some real life highlighters, I tried to make the asset look more neon in color, even if the overall color was ironically less neon green overall. Perhaps it feels more vibrant regardless because of the shine I added to their body. Also, the highlighter sticker was simplified a bit since there's no longer text on the front of their body that screams "Highlighter" on it. Well, you don't need to state the obvious, said Indigo indirectly, though it was humorous trying to adjust the colors of the sticker properly. But the actual biggest change I made came with the inside of the highlighter. The black top that surrounded the highlighter tip drowned out and can now be visible even when the cap is on. This was inspired by the design of a couple specific highlighter brands, and although I do feel like it may be a controversial choice, it may help this design stand out more in a potential crowd of highlighter characters. Here's the last asset for part 2, and guess what, I managed to steal this character from Inanimate Insanity. Just kidding, I didn't actually steal anyone, but rather I said this because the next character likes to look on the bright side of things in a more literal way, and they share an object type with the II character. Yes, it's Lightbulb, and ironically this Lightbulb isn't even turned on at all. I mean, they can turn themselves on, but they blind themselves temporarily doing so. That's not the point, moving on. One of the main differences come in the form of the bulb itself. It is now a much more consistent curve, and unlike the old asset, it doesn't chop the circle with a straight line at the bottom of the glass bulb. God, that feels like such a weird analogy to make when it comes to designs of objects. And if you remember what Indigo said about lighting in the glass of water section, you'll remember that glass has no dark spots. But considering the way that I've seen her constantly draw glass objects, I figured the opposite side of where the light hits is also bright as well. The little spirals around the metal base of the bulb are slightly different, not drastically, but they do feel slightly more realistic when they're not constrained to the line art of the rest of the asset, in my opinion. Also, the spirals no longer drive down to the circular bottom because that just doesn't look good in my opinion. Finally, the little metal wires on the interior of the bulb got changed as well. They might look weird, but it is A, in fact, realistic, and B, barely noticeable in an actual character pose. Although they barely got any runtime in Cal's Lifeline, I honestly think this little guy is someone I'm rather excited to work with. Next up, we have a character whose name doesn't seem to actually correlate with what they are, or at least not in terms of visuals for the most part, because this next character is Map, or if you're going by the original sign-up data, their name is something along the lines of $P. Who here really wants to try and pronounce that amalgamation of characters out every time they mention their name? Which is why their name was unofficially changed to Map, since they kind of do look like one. I say kind of because they're red for some reason, and they have these two arrows sticking out of their head. But surprisingly, they are fireproof, which is something that may be important to keep in mind later on. Map's actual design didn't change a whole lot. Their layout is mostly the same as it was in the old version, except for some hopefully obvious tweaks, like the black strip of their body being separated in line art, for example. Also, I'm going to stop mentioning Indigo influences in these last two parts because looking back, it sounds way too much like I'm just trying to mimic her design. Regardless of whether or not you think that, Map as a whole is made a lot less linear in terms of line art. The bent arrow on the top of their head is now curvy, and their body is now curved inward slightly. Also, the light red markings were enhanced to look a bit more like a stain in their body, even if I don't actually know what it is. I also don't know what the light red circles on the right side of the body are either, but I kept them relatively the same. Pretty interesting first character for this part of the series. And now, the award for the formerly most overcomplicated object character name in the history of the object show community goes to this fella. Their name used to be M.I.L for some godforsaken reason that even their creator can't seem to explain anymore. And if that name sounds like quite a mouthful to you, then I don't blame you, since they were recently renamed to just M.I.L. But just know that in terms of object type, M.I.L is actually just a tablet. In terms of what brand they are, it is very likely that M.I.L was the company, based on my perspective. But based on the fact that the creator couldn't tell me, I don't actually know whether or not that's a fact. For now, it rests as an assumption on my part, especially considering the fact that M.I.L as a part of the character's name is no more. But one of M.I.L's most distinct features is the crack running through the top right of the screen. Just like the branding issue, I don't really know where the cracked screen came from, but it does make them stand out a bit more in design. After all, electronic phone-like characters are rather common in the object show community. Just ask Inanimate Insanity or Object Invasion, for example. The crack was modified in terms of shape just so that it didn't look like those parts of the glass were about to fall off of their body. Also, the rim of the tablet was made thinner in order for the screen to be larger in size. And as for the screen itself, visualization and a character equals an excuse to add some good old gradation to the screen. The border of the screen had its color changed as well, so it would apply more to the brightness of the screen instead of the dullness of the metal border. And really, that's it. I do love the fact that they are solar powered on a different note, so go for green energy representation in this cast. If you remember part 1 of this series, you'll remember the main host of this show, a DanganRonpa inspired character by the name of Monocoin. And this next contestant is also DanganRonpa inspired, as well as being inspired by the exact same DanganRonpa character, Monokuma. But in terms of personality, this next character, Monokuma File, is about as opposite from Monocoin as you could get. While this is one of those shows where the host might be viewable as the main antagonist, Kuma might end up getting vibes of a main protagonist based on her personality. But I don't know that for sure. I don't want to give out roles to anyone just yet. Just know that's based on her personality alone. Monokuma File is also the opposite of Glass of Water in another way, because she is extremely lucky. So lucky in fact that she was once able to make two bullets collide with each other mid-air. But enough about the possible spoiler alerts. What about her design? Well, the text on her that says Monokuma File has been removed, since it might have been slightly redundant design even if it was part of the official DanganRonpa Monokuma File. However, from what I know about DanganRonpa, this paper version of the object was only maintained in the first game. Ever since then, the Monokuma File was turned digital. So I figured it would be okay to experiment with the design itself a little. First of all, by enhancing the Monokuma face on the bottom right of the character, and second of all, by changing the layout of the object slightly to look more like a file folder. Well, it's definitely a rather large change made for this object, but it is realistic to an actual file folder, which I assume the original Monokuma File was inspired by. Other shading changes, including changing the angle of the shading itself, as well as giving the body some gradation, were also implemented. Gradation was also applied to the tag as well, which by the way, the number 4 on the paper stickout has to do with the fact that Kuma File was the 4th child in their family, according to their creator Tadabi Wubby 57. If I were caught in this mess, I know who I'd try to befriend immediately. Oh god, this next character. For someone with such a light-hearted and friendly personality, trying to draw them in asset form is nothing less than an unhinged nightmare for an object artist. For me, at least, drawing vehicles can be an absolute pain in the ass at times. And the creation of this next character, Moped, is another example to add to that list of hatred for vehicle drawing. And like Ginscap, learning Blender in order to do some more perspective angles of this character almost feels like a goddamn necessity, because they are complicated. Me trying to explain the process of redesigning this character almost borders on the territory of ranting about this character, because there are so many different details that have to be taken into consideration here. Sure, the main body of this character and a front-facing asset isn't the worst thing in the world, but trying to secure the proper shape for the front segment of Moped was slightly annoying to do properly. The headlights weren't that difficult either, but as for the grips that the driver would normally hold onto when they're driving a motorcycle, or a moped in this case, it was slightly difficult to ensure a more dynamic shape for them. Furthermore, they have to be separated into 3 different layers in order to prevent conflict between line art colors. I decided to make the shading of the left handle different in this asset remake, since they are more in the light than the right side in most of these perspectives. And alright, maybe the glass shield on the top of their head wasn't that hard either, but it was a bit annoying to ensure the shape of the shield itself was proper. I am realizing that there were some details here that I forgot to add, primarily the 2 whisker-like poles jutting out from each side of Moped's head that you can see the old asset. But even at this point, I would be mentally tired enough to not want to care about trying to fix that mistake. I don't know what these poles are actually called, but I do know that some mopeds do have them, and some mopeds don't. So I mentally would use that as an excuse to not bother adding the poles. And yet, funny enough, I still remember to add on Moped's signature peace sign, since he is the type to not want any fights to occur around him, and his license plate was added as well. One last challenge remained for this front-facing asset, being the tires. I struggled with trying to keep the tires a proper size, especially for the upcoming side perspective, which that is more commonly used with Moped. But right now they weren't awful. I added some gradation to the tires as well as some grooves to represent what an actual tire looks like in real life. Because tell me, have you ever seen any commonly used motor vehicle have completely smooth tires? Probably not, because they are freaking dangerous. And even though it was canonical that Moped's tires were supposed to be smoothed out for the most part, I decided to give them some light grooves anyways, because if they were completely smooth, well then that's just freaking cruel for Moped. Alrighty, this design has been quite a mouthful to take in, but guess what? we are not done. In order to properly remake the character poses, perspective is an absolute necessity with Moped. It is true that most of the added design in perspective isn't that complicated, since it is mostly just a section of the Moped where someone would actually sit. Trying to keep a more or proper line art might have been tricky, but the concept itself isn't. And the seat was made more realistic compared to the clunky box that a person would have had to sit on to drive the old Moped design. Where this perspective really came to throw hands with their maker is once again the tires. Some added designs had to be added to make the sides of the tires actually look realistic, and the tire grooves had to be adjusted to ensure they actually still fit with the form of the tires. Here, the annoyance comes with trying to figure out how to draw these tires properly, and furthermore, making sure that they were actually the right size. They weren't the right size, I had to shrink them down. But once the tires were done, this is finally all that has to be said about Moped's designing process. Except for those two poles, but at the time when I was finishing this asset, I was just so goddamn tired of this character. He's a bit of a sweetheart, but when it comes to drawing him, screw this. Absolutely annoying trying to maintain enough energy to do this entire asset in one sitting. Phew, that last character put me a bit over the edge. Thankfully, this next character is both also a sweetheart, and a fair amount easier to draw than Moped was. Pastel Box wasn't originally in the cast of Last Lifeline, but they may as well have been because they debuted on the second episode. Also, she doesn't have any legs, but to make up for that fact, she's able to fly with her two wings. Maybe not that high, however, and definitely not with enough focus to even think about escaping the situation they've ended up in. But she can fly. The funny thing is, most of the time spent on this character had to do with her accessories, and not her main body itself. Her main body is just a box, which has absolutely nothing complicated to it. As for the wings, however, trying to keep the line art of the wings proper was both important for this character, and also pretty time consuming. I couldn't just duplicate the wings from one side to another either, because in concept, they were meant to reflect upon some angel devil balancing. In other words, one wing reflected upon a mythical kind-hearted creature, and the other wing reflected upon a mythical devilish creature. In terms of personality, the angel side definitely prevails, however, which might lead some to question why the design concept exists anyways. But after the wings are done, there was just her hat left to do, which wasn't difficult, but I had to rush a couple of details since I wasn't on a time crunch with this asset. Luckily, it's not like her hat was that complicated anyways. But yeah, there's Pastel Box. Not sure how useful she is during this scenario, but as a friend, she's definitely high up on that list. Here's a spoiler alert. Please do not get too attached to this next character, if you even can, because they're a simp in all caps. And they've also inspired by the My Hero Academia character, Mineta, alongside her character quirk, Pop-Off. This is Pop-Off Ball, and her design is pretty much just Mineta's hairstyle in object form. While it sounds like a character who could actually be worth something, and Last Lifeline they were just created as a puppet character by the host to prevent giving anyone a protagonist or antagonist arc complex, and thus were killed off first. If the show version is true to form in that sense, then Pop-Off Ball might be killed off first there as well. And that I can state because I'm pretty sure that's what Calculovo, the host of the original Lifeline, would have wanted anyways. Anyways, her design didn't really change that much at all. Most of the changes came in the form of color and shading, but the topmost small ball attached to her body does look more visually planted into her than it did in the original version. Also, there is a little bit of light shining onto all the four small balls, because even if it is not the most realistic for shading, That's what the shading for Minata's hairstyle looked like in the anime. And that's it really. Maybe if Minata was less Minata, then Pop-Off Ball wouldn't have been in this scenario at all. Rest in peace, Part 3. You may or may not be missed. And the reason I made that analogy is because this is not only the last character of this part of the series, but their name is Red Ink Pen. Take the first letter of each word and you'll understand why I made that analogy. To some, Red Ink Pen may as well just be a more emo version of BFDI's pen. Not only in terms of color scheme, but also because they've hidden both their eyes behind a layer of leaking red ink. It's the closest thing we'll get to human blood in this universe. Also, here's another tidbit for you guys to know. When they were first introduced to Cal's Lifeline, Red Ink Pen was, in fact, white. Why are you white? But after they were eliminated in Cal's Lifeline, their creator, Karlmnock, decided to change their look from white to black. Reminds me of Michael Jackson. God, that joke absolutely sucks. Why did I say that? My thoughts are way too impulsive sometimes, but regardless, most of the changes made to RIP involve shading changes, like always. But the two strokes on the bottom of their body were actually made more wavy compared to the original, which were more straight then. This asset remake ended up using a lot more gradation than the original, you may also notice. In the remake, RIP was also made slightly taller, since a pen in real life is more tall than it is wide. And as for the pen cap, the handle of said cap was flattened at the bottom and made slightly more linear as a whole, since most handles for pen caps are not this curvy. Finally, the leaking ink that comes off of his head was modified to try and look more realistic compared to the old version. The ink also got some slightly more in-depth shading. However, I do have to wonder why Red Ink Pen let his ink leak enough that it caused him to look like an emo. His vision isn't impaired, but maybe he wouldn't be talking so much about his lack of romance if he just washed his face every once in a while. Here's the thing, this next contestant isn't on the counter. That's because their asset actually isn't being remade, for reasons I'll explain in a second, and reasons you can probably see right now. This is Silhouette, and that may be considered notorious in terms of object type here. And once again, you can probably see why. It's because they're humanoid. Now, was that the only reason I'm not revamping this character's design? No. The other reason why I'm not revamping this character's design is because, honestly, a revamped design would not look that different. Silhouette as a character is just meant to be like a strange blue mass that spends most of their time shapeshifted as a night character. And they are pure blue. There is not meant to be any color variation on them whatsoever, except for their face. Plus, yes, it is true that they were a pain in the ass to make the first time. But even if you could argue that I could try to shade them for improvements, tell me, how difficult will that be to maintain consistently across different poses? I'd rather use the cheat that is adding a bevel effect for shading personally, thank you very much. But I'm adding this character here just so we know they all exist, since they're getting the short end of the stick here. Now we shall finish off these assets for real this time. But oh boy, what a challenge we are starting this final part off with. Although Moped overall took the longest amount of time to create, not only does this next character come in second place for the sheer amount of time it took to create their asset, but considering they are the second smallest sized character in the entire cast, they are the most detailed in the entire cast as well. The deliberate fusion between two different character designs and even two different characters as a whole, and when you combine two characters that individually would not be considered a good friend, you get one of the most wild card characters in the entire cast, Snowglobe. She could be considered to be rather similar to the inanimate insanity character Yin Yang. Go ahead, Cozy Snowglobe. I called Snowglobe a Yin Yang situation again, so go ahead, eat my legs. But in the eyes of most people, this isn't a balance between good and bad personalities. They are opposite personalities, yes, but a major factor in this balance is the fact that both sides hate each other. One side of this character, under the name Bo, whom individually you can see drawn here by the creator Cozy Snowglobe, could be considered what most of the Democrats in the USA see what most of the Republicans as: dumb, uneducated, and quick to anger. And the other half of this character, Snow, could be considered the closest thing we'll ever get to an objectification of Marjorie Taylor Greene, a hardcore Christian who believes the Bible should define the entire world. Yes, religion does exist in the Last Lifeline universe. It's mentioned in the disclaimer posted in the Chromatic Embassy. You don't have to like that fact, but denying it doesn't make it any less true. Furthermore, they are both opposite and other things too. Bo is considered to be quite radical behavior, and Snow is considered to be more timid. Snow also can be considered to be quite the neat freak, while Bo isn't afraid to get down and dirty whenever they have to. Now do you see why they hate each other? But how does all of this affect the design? Well, for starters, the snow portion of the asset, or the main snow globe itself, can be considered to be rather cleanly and well kept. Also, the cross design on their wooden base was inspired by the actual reference drawings of snow that Cozy Snowglobe had posted, although it had never been ported into the combined character of Snowglobe before. The glass ball of the Snowglobe was made a bit shinier, and although it is true that the falling snow is static currently, I might try to make it so that it is more animated down the road. I just didn't think too much about that here. However, the bow that is physically attached to her is not well kept at all. It is all torn up, and some patches had to be stitched back together since she was just far too damn reckless here. The wear and tear on the bow wasn't prevalent in the old version of the asset, but I added it because it was realistic to Bo as a separate character, hence the references. And I was also contemplating having parts of the bow be covered in dirt as well, for the same reasons. But I'm pretty sure when Snow's in control, she would hate to see that constantly, hence why it's not a part of the permanent asset since she'd likely just wash it off quickly. So yes, Snowglobe as a character was damn time consuming. But honestly, I'm nowhere near as frustrated about this asset as I was with Moped's asset. Since you want to know something about how I feel with this asset, I honestly think this was one of the best I have ever made. I feel like the amount of time in this asset really came through personally at least, and although they are complicated to the eye, I feel like everything makes sense here. And truthfully, when it comes to time taken, I'd rather be spending this much on a rowdy character like Snowglobe instead of the peace-loving character Moped, since it just feels more fitting this way. Oh, Jesus, please forgive me, because I have sinned. And do I say that next because I'm a hardcore Christian myself? The answer is no. But to be fair, although this next character is also Christian, much like Snow of Snowglobe, they are much more liberal about it than Snow ever will be. Strawberry Milk on the surface is a fair amount of a sweetheart, and although they are slightly religious, they won't ever try to talk over it to you constantly. She is also probably the only character in the entire cast who wears clothing on a regular basis, being her skirt. And no, Snowglobe's bow doesn't count because she physically cannot take it off even if she tried. Strawberry's milk is stored within a mason jar, but they do live quite dangerously because they never keep a lid on. The overall shading of the glass jar was updated as per the glass shading pointers that Indigo had given out for characters like Glass of Water and Lightbulb in previous parts. I didn't reduce on the amount of internal lines as much this time just because I wanted to make sure it was obvious what the shape of the jar was supposed to be, nor did I want any shading to overlap and make the fill all blurry. There is a bit less milk inside of her this time, probably because of the fact that it's difficult to maintain a higher level without spilling it. But having no milk inside of her would kill her, which is why she can't just let it all spill. The milk is her blood. Also, the straw was adjusted in this asset so that it would actually lean up against the top of the mason jar, and not look like it was defying gravity. And the sticker lost its line art in order to feel slightly more realistic, although I didn't change the line art of the strawberry on the label at all. I did, however, make said line art darker. Finally, there's just her skirt left. Drawing her skirt was slightly complicated only because I was uncertain on how I should have dealt with its design. I didn't change the line art of the skirt that much, but I did want to change the shading of the skirt to look more proportional, and also so I could minimize the amount of line art on the skirt. Took me some time, but in the end I did get a result I was decently happy with. There's also the tie on the top of her skirt, which didn't change much except for recoloring and trying to make it fit more properly to form. And yeah, that's strawberry milk. Don't drink her. Next up is an object whom, for a while, I had absolutely no idea what they even were. This is Tablecard, and when I saw him for the first time, my brain, which was filled with nonsense, constantly thought he looked like a basketball nets post. But that was not true on so many levels. It's just I had never actually heard of a Tablecard that much before I saw the character. Or, at least not in the form that Tablecard was, with only his head being an actual Tablecard, and his main body being a specific design for a Tablecard holder. And that caused some issues to take place in the old version of the asset, such as his mouth not being properly connected to the pole that holds him up, or the paper not actually looking like a table card. By the way, the mouth is the little O-shaped piece that you would see on the top of this specific table card holder, which is why it being not connected was a major flaw on my part. But really, the design as a whole didn't change that much. The shading was just adjusted slightly for the most part. The head could have been reshaded in a way similar to the way Blank Square was reshaded earlier on, but I wanted to maintain some variation between object types. So, although the paper was given gradations similar to Blank Square, the shading was mostly fit around the table card holder that his head was sat on. Although you do not see the mouthpiece in this asset remaking sequence specifically, you will see it in the asset comparison. And the fact that Tablecard overall wasn't a complicated design meant that not a whole lot about him changed in this remake, other than what was just said. This guy is such a winner, he won twice in Cal's Lifeline. The joke is, they placed 11th in the camp version, but on a related note, they were also eliminated on the 11th episode. What a way to mock the winner with numbers, to be honest. Speaking of which, the design of this character is really simple actually. Although the original version of the asset did still pose multiple flaws here, such as the reference of the character made by the creator, cost, not having the exclamation mark at the end, the text overall being horribly made, the body being a bit too red, etc, etc. But since they are just a rectangular prism with the text winner on the front of them, they were not that difficult to revamp. Really, most of the changes here involve giving their body some proper gradation, which now goes from white to a slightly more reddish white at the bottom. And for the text, I didn't try to draw it out by hand this time. I just used whatever font I believed would look best for the winner as a character, just with some rescaling modifications. And then I gave the text some shading as well by utilizing a tool known as masking. And really, that's it. Next up, I shall revamp the loser. And no, not really. The next character isn't really the loser, but that's a joke because this character is named the winner. Yeah, you don't get it, whatever. Never mind. That sucked. Time's ticking, my friends. Don't be lazy, or else the clock will get you. Okay, I don't think that's actually a reference to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon in any way, shape, or form. But when the name of this character is Time Gear, I couldn't help but make some stupid analogy. I don't really know anything about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, so I don't know what purpose a Time Gear actually serves inside the game. But the idea of Pokemon and exploration is reflected well when it comes to this character's personality. Time Gear is quite the explorer, even if they are rather timid for the most part. But talking about the design now, you might notice I started by creating some rather large line art hexagons. That's because at a base level, Time Gear is really just a bunch of resized and rotated hexagons with some grooves to make the gear. Plus, it's more efficient than some of the other ways I've tried making hexagons from scratch. One of the major changes I made to the line art as a whole is that I made Time Gear's grooves stand out a bit less. Even if I did like the original shape of Time Gear, the grooves are a bit too long for an actual Time Gear. And the creator, Moo Maximus, seemed to want me to fix that at least a little bit. And thus, I did. Really, that was the only really major change I made to Time Gear's design. Most of the fixture designs that are engraved into a Time Gear really only changed in terms of color, but I did have some troubles with trying to remake them properly. Also, the shine of the Time Gear was made a bit more tilted since it usually does look at least a little better in my opinion. The gear as a whole did look a bit too rounded in terms of design in my opinion, and when I showed Max the asset remake, they pointed out the same. So off camera, I did make the edges of the gear a bit more straight. And guess what? Time is up. It's been a long journey, my fellow viewers, but after 26 assets made, we are at the finish line. And remember when I mentioned Gamer Token a while back, and alongside that mentioned how there were 2 token characters in the cast? Well, I hope you're patient enough to see this other token character, whose name is a lot more simple than Gamer's. This is Tokeny, and remaking his design was really a bit of a breeze because the design of Tokeny is almost exactly that of Gamer Token's, just without the headphones, and Tokeny being cyan blue instead of green. However, I did not really want the process of remaking this asset to be that simple for the viewers, so I did copy over the design of Gamer Tokens in a bit more of a complicated manner than I really needed to. And for the most part, the process of making Tokeny's asset is exactly the same as it was to making Gamer Token's asset. The major difference here is that while I mentioned having removed the 2-letter symbolization from Gamer Token a while back, Tokeny kept their 2-letter symbolization of TP, and they are not going to be losing it in this remake either, because what would it be changed to? I don't know, and I don't think you'd know either. I did try to make that symbol a bit more by hand than just using a font, also primarily so it can make perspective of Tokeny in the same way I wanted to make perspective of Gamer Token. And with that, my friends, we are done. All 27 Last Lifeline assets have now been remade. If you stuck with me for this entire video of the mini-series, thank you, it means a lot. It took me over 2 weeks for me to edit both the original parts of this series, as well as this enhanced full version of the mini-series. Was it worth it? I have no idea for you guys, but for me, I definitely think it was. This will definitely not be the last time I record myself making assets either, just for the record. If you want to stay updated for Last Lifeline and its progression, then join the Chromatic Embassy, my Discord server linked in the description below. Also, like and subscribe so you'll be able to see new videos regarding Last Lifeline, asset creations, or anything else you might be interested in general. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.